接下来这场演讲，讲师是来自 Pillow Castle Games 的 Albert， 题目为跳脱框架思考 Superliminal 开发经验谈。
好，大家好，我叫 Albert， 然后今天要讲的主题是 Thinking Outside the Box。好，首先道个歉，因为我在美国出生，在台湾长大，然后现在又回美国住了差不多10年了，所以我英文会讲其实比较顺一点。So for the rest of the talk, I'll just be giving it in English. Okay, so who am I? I'm Albert. I was game director on Superliminal. Superliminal was developed by our small indie company called Pillow Castle. At the most, we had 7 people. And Superliminal is about forced perspective. So what forced perspective is an optic illusion created by the ambiguity of depth. So you might have seen it before in art or photography, but it's also used in different places, such as in movies. So for example, in the Charlie Chaplin film, they use forced perspective to make a stunt that looks very dangerous, actually very safe. And more modern example, they used it in Lord of the Rings to make the practical effect of making Frodo look a lot smaller than Gandalf. And so Superliminal is a game that takes forced perspective and uses it as its main mechanic. So here, for example, you can move an object around, and based on what you're looking at, the object becomes larger or smaller based on your perspective. We have different mechanics as well. So for example, here where a kind of 2D image on the wall becomes a real 3D object. And so a lot of people ask, what led to this mechanic? And how did we think of this? Actually, at the beginning, I was just thinking about a way to move objects. Because a lot of puzzle games are actually about moving objects in different ways in physical space. I tried a lot of different things, at least mentally, and I thought about flipping things around, moving spaces around, but all of that seemed too complicated. In the end, I asked myself, well, what if I just drop this object down? And it didn't quite make sense, but then, when I figured it out, it totally made sense. And so this was a question I was thinking about actually for a while, before I went to bed. And I think that did help. So how does forced perspective work in our game? The theories are actually really simple, right? So we have an object that's lined up in 2 different sizes, like this. Then it kind of looks the same, right? And the reason is because imagine all these are rays of light hitting this object, and they're all hitting the same place. So to the camera, it looks the same. Except that's not exactly true. So here's an example where you're moving an object around, and because it's at different distances, you can see the lighting change and the shadows change a lot, right? At the beginning, we were concerned about this because it kind of broke the illusion of the game a little bit, but at the same time, it kind of made the object feel more in world, and so in the end, we thought that this was an okay effect to have. The math is actually super simple, right? The math is just, if something is twice as far away, it just needs to be twice as large. And the reason is kind of weird, but it's just because everything is linear here, right? All the rays of light, all the distances are linear, so you just kind of multiply it by the same ratio. But sometimes the parts that seem easy are hard, and the parts that seem hard are easy. So the actual hard part of the mechanic for us was trying to figure out where the object should be. And this was difficult because sometimes you had a regularly shaped object against an irregularly shaped background. And so what that meant was, in some cases like this, it was okay, but, what if there was a point in the background that was sticking out? And then we had to find ways to kind of mitigate this so there weren't so many edge cases. Another part that was actually kind of difficult was kind of getting this illusion to look correct. The first part is actually really simple, right? To get this illusion on the wall, what you do is you just have a camera take a screenshot of this object and then project it out at the same exact spot. So that will give you a pretty accurate representation. But the hard part for us was actually trying to cut out the silhouette from the environment, right? And because when you don't have that, it becomes pretty difficult to find the exact spot where you're supposed to line the object up, and people will often get confused and think, no, I'm at the right spot, when they actually aren't. And so to do this, we actually had to incorporate depth and all that information that's similar to a light casting shadows, right? But to be more in depth than that, ask Phil, our graphics programmer. So, just as some hard parts seem easy and some easy parts seem hard, the actual hard part, I feel like, was figuring out the whole development schedule. And so for us, this actually took a really long time, right? And actually at the very beginning, and let's say 2014, I asked one of my teachers at the time, there's this prototype that I'm working on and people seem to like it, but I know it's going to take a bunch of years to finish, because I know that games like this, first-person puzzle games, they usually take, 3 or 4 years at least to finish. And so, the teacher in question, Jesse Shih at the time, said, basically, I don't have any evidence to base this on, but in my experience, if people really like a thing right now, if they forget about it for a couple years, they'll still come back and really like it once they see it again. So it turned out he was right. And, things like that and other things that happened during development helped actually drive the development along, even though it took such a long time. So let me kind of go over how this whole process went, because it was kind of a crazy process. And, while we were going through it, there are definitely a lot of doubts and questions through our minds. Okay, so first of all, in 2012, I only worked 1 week on this, and it was for a class project. And this is one of the types of projects where I could choose anything. It was actually an AI class. And that image is when I finally finished it, and I posted to a game development club at our college, and I thought it was really cool. And then after that, I didn't work on it for half a year. And so then came the summer of 2013. I had a lot of time on my hands, and I wanted to make a prototype for Sense of Wonder Night, which is kind of like an experimental showcase. And so I took a couple weeks and I polished it up. I added a few more puzzles. I made the mechanic less finicky. And after 6 weeks, I basically sent in the prototype. And then after that, I didn't touch it again for another half year. And this time, I pitched the idea for a class project. I invited some students along, and we worked on the project for 1 year. But even actually before we began, we posted a video of the game online. And for some reason, it did super well. It got more than 1 million views in, let's say, a week. And that was really surprising. And it was surprising, because there was a lot of views. But the other thing is that it was the same exact video that, was posted by the Sense of Wonder Night YouTube channel. So this video existed. This video was out there. And to me, that just says that even if you have something that's really cool, sometimes it's just not put in the right place. It's just not going to get spread. And that was really interesting for me. And so we did 1 year on the class project. Our goal was always to finish that and come out strong and be able to go full-time into the game and finish it. But, on one hand, we didn't make a lot of progress. On the other hand, there are a lot of issues that were very hard to figure out. So, for example, we all needed salaries, and a lot of us needed visas as well. So it was just a very, very difficult situation. So instead, I just went back to solo development again. And for 2015, I just worked on the game myself and, did some part-time job on the side. And around the middle of the year, I submitted the game for Indiecade. And Indiecade is a small conference and I didn't really expect anything from it. But funnily enough, there was a single person who came and recorded a video of the game, and that video actually, blew up and got tons of views. And this is another one of those incidents that kind of helped us push the project along. And so in 2016, somebody saw the video and contacted me and wanted to work together. And so Logan and I, worked together on puzzles, different ideas. We pitched the game, and we finally got funding at the end of 2016. And from then on, we just, slowly built the team up a little bit more, got a little bit more progress, and slowly in 2019, finally released the game. So how does thinking outside the box tie into all of this? So thinking outside the box is actually one of the design principles that we used in the game. And the reason is there's actually a couple of reasons. One is that it kind of ties into the idea of, perspective and optical illusions and all that. But on the other hand, it's also the type of puzzle game that generally I'm interested in. Okay, so for example, I feel like the most interesting puzzles in puzzle games are the ones that make you think outside the box a little bit, right? So for example, here in Portal, it's when you use momentum for the first time. And instead of doing a puzzle that's just, a bunch of different levers or buttons that are hooked together and you just need to figure out the right order to do them in, right now, in this puzzle, you have to think in a very different way from what you're used to. And to me, that's a really interesting type of feeling. And so unlike others, like order of operation puzzles, that you can solve eventually, but you just have to work your way through it. And that's why in the end, we try to do more types of the puzzles in the game. And I think, you could debate whether it's successful or not. I think there's some parts we failed at, and there are some parts we succeeded at. But in the end, I think it was good that we'd at least tried it. So besides that, I think thinking outside the box also applies to game development as well. And then it's because in any creative industry, I think there are a lot of cases where it feels like things are either a hit or a miss, right? And besides that, surviving in the game industry is pretty hard. It's hard just making a single game, right? And it's harder then to even have that game sell and do well. The way I see it is that there are so many games out there and so many games that I've seen and that I thought were interesting, but I've never bought. And this is, for example, my Steam wish list. All these games I've seen multiple times, and they're in categories that I do play, but for some reason I never bought them. And I kind of apply that to other people as well. So I know that, for someone to buy my game, it has to be there has to be extremely good reason. And so, when you have such a long development schedule and that, surviving in the game industry is really hard, you generally look for kind of advice or answers, and generally you'll get a lot of them, So for example, people say a lot of different kinds of things, right? People say, hey, you need to have great art, so your game will be able to sell well, right? Or you need to be in the market first. You need to be on new platforms like VR or the Switch, or you need to make games that are replayable and appeal to streamers or content creators. Or hey, marketing is the main point. You need to get a good publisher who's well known and they'll market the game for you. Or maybe you need smaller games, so there's less people required, you have more room for error, and there's more profits, right? Or you need to make larger games, so there's less competition. And there's so many different ways, I think, that people will say that you need to succeed in the industry. And the problem, I think, is generally all of this is pretty good advice, but you can only pick one or two as the thing you're doing. right? And a lot of these are actually contradictory. And I think any advice is only really valid if they fulfill a certain amount of requirements. So it's like there's a silent if before these advice. For example, if you're really good with technology, and if you're good, you have good relationships with platforms, hey, then maybe jumping on VR is a good idea, right? Or maybe if you like building smaller games, and you don't have that many resources, then making smaller games is a really good idea. But not all of this applies to everyone. And everyone has very particular circumstances that kind of change everything, right? So it's really hard to apply general rules like these to everyone in game development. The way I see it is like this. There's so many different flavors of snacks out there. You can't really say that to sell a snack it needs to be spicy or sweet or salty, but it can be all different types of flavors, right? And so there's so many different ways to get success. You just need to find the way that works for you. And as an afterthought, these are only just the top 30 snacks at 7-Eleven, right? There's so many more out there. So here's maybe some examples of where generally good advice, doesn't work for particular games. So for example, your art, it needs to be good, right? Your art should generally be as good as possible. And that's not always true. So for example, this is Undertale's art book, and in it they talk about, having art that's too good, and they actually wanted some crappier versions of their art instead. And the reason is because Undertale is setting a very particular expectation, right? They want players to come in the game thinking that the game's not going to amount to much, and then they're going to slap them in the face with, emotion and story and all that. And so because the game has this type of subversive tone, it definitely works for the game. Another general rule that you might say is very good is, if you can't afford it, you should hire someone to do the things that you're not good at, right? Generally, that sounds like a very good idea. But for Lucas Pope in The Return of the Obra Dinn, he actually did basically everything himself. So he's mostly, coming from a programming background and a design background, but he learned how to do the art, and he made all the art himself as well. And that seems like a crazy thing to do, but he has a good reason, right? So for example, here he says he can do everything a little bit, so he's a really bad micromanager. I kind of get that. And also that a lot of times the game is just in his head, right? So communication is hard, and also telling people to cut their work is hard as well. And that totally makes sense, right? So sometimes these general rules can be broken for, very good reasons. And here's a third example. If you make a game, you should pick the best game engine, right? Maybe go with Unreal, maybe go with Unity, pick something that's powerful and versatile, that can do a little bit of everything. But on the other hand, all these games are made with GameMaker. That's not saying GameMaker is a bad engine, but, it's usually not the one that people recommend. But there are a lot of benefits, right? For example, you can get into design faster. You don't really need to worry about how physics, works on a frame-by-frame level. Okay, fine, You say, I get your point, so I should just look at what other people do and do that, right? No, that's actually bad. And the reason is because, for example, if you take a look at all these games that use GameMaker, they probably have very specific reasons why they did it, right? A lot of these creators, they have been creating for a long time, so GameMaker is the tool that they're most familiar with. Other groups, maybe, they don't have a very strong programming background. And so they want something where designers can jump right in and start working. There's also other possibilities as well. Maybe, they succeeded despite the engine they chose. Maybe they regret using that engine and they have had to port to different platforms later. it's really hard to say without knowing the actual reason. So I listened to this podcast called Script Notes. It's on screenwriting, and Craig Mason has actually this really good quote. So he's the writer of Chernobyl, and he's also doing the new Last of Us show. Right, so basically he's talking about scripts here, right? And the rules that people talk about when they talk about script writing. And he says, each success is an exception, so don't follow what they did. If anything, the best way to achieve success is to be an exception. And here's a totally different way to see it, right? Which is, hey, 60% of restaurants fail on the first year, and nearly 80% of restaurants fail by the fifth year, right? So in other words, most people out there might be failing, so you might as well do something new and do something weird and do something unexpected. Maybe you'll have a better chance that way. So another thing that you should probably think about is that when you're taking a look at games that are in their completed state and you're trying to analyze them or dissect them, you're actually doing a post-mortem instead of seeing how they got there. And so that's kind of what we did by accident too, right? We were looking at first-person puzzle games and trying to see like, oh, what they all did, and trying to think if it was a good idea. But the problem is we don't really see why they made those choices. Sometimes they made a choice because it was the cheapest thing to do or the easiest thing to do. It doesn't necessarily mean it was the best thing to do, right? So you don't know. And so that's a very dangerous part of just looking at the completed state of successful games. Another problem people run into is the fallacy called the Flaw of Averages. So for example, maybe you say, hey, I don't know what I should do for this part of my game. Maybe I'll take a look at all the games out there and try to see what people do, right? Maybe I'll take a look at everyone out there and try to use what game engine everyone's using. And the problem with that is this, right? So let me give you an example. In the 1950s, the U.S. Air Force wanted to redesign their cockpit for pilots, and so they measured a bunch of dimensions in order to find the average dimension, and they wanted to base the cockpit design on the average dimension. That seems to make sense, kind of on face value, but one of the researchers did the math and it didn't make sense at all. So if you pick any 3 dimensions, only 3.5% of the pilots would be average size in all 3 dimensions. And so, in game development, if you take a look at what other people are doing and you just do that, then I think you would fall in the same problem, which is that sometimes things just won't fit, who you are or your team or your resources, and it just won't be a good fit. Another good rule to think about is the first in mind rule. So this is from the 22 Immutable Laws of Marketing. So what this means is when you're talking about a product in a category, usually the top couple of spots are the most important spots by far. So for example, when you think of soda, maybe you think Coke, maybe Pepsi, maybe Sprite. And beyond that, it gets harder and harder, right? And those top couple spots are very, very hard to get into. A good example that the book uses is Pepsi versus Cola, right? And so this is, years ago, of course. So they're saying that, Pepsi spends millions of dollars each year more on marketing than Coca-Cola just to keep the second spot. And the reason is that, when people think about soda, they always go for Coca-Cola first, right? Even though Pepsi and Coca-Cola, they're more or less the same thing. It's really hard to break that barrier once somebody comes first in their mind already. So here's the problem with doing things that other successful people are doing already. The problem is because they kind of did it already, right? So for example, if you see a game that's really successful and you try to base your game off of that, people who come in will think of that game first. when they want to play something of that category, right? And that's the danger of it, right? So let me give you an example that might be a little bit obvious, but okay. And let's say the Legend of Zelda, right? It's a great game. Maybe you look at this game and you think, wow, that's such an awesome game. I want to make something like it. And so one day somebody gives you, millions of dollars of budget and a great team, quality team to match the team that made The Legend of Zelda, and also a giant marketing budget, right? And so you make a game similar and you call it The Tales of Brandon, right? And you're thinking, wow, this game is going to sell really well. But the problem is, even though you do a bunch of marketing and people, maybe they're like, cool, this seems like a cool game that I might like, they'll always go to The Legend of Zelda first because it exists first, right? Even if your game is slightly better. If your game is not substantially better, then they'll say, hey, I'm going with the familiar thing that I already know, that I already trust. So that's a problem. And so then how do you win, right? There are so many games out there. How do you actually succeed? When there are so many games that already come first in the category, right? And it's something called market segmentation. And what that means is really, if you can't succeed in a certain category, what you do is you make your own category, right? So for example, let's say you make a game similar to Legend of Zelda, but instead of having it released on Nintendo, you make the game free to play and you release on all platforms, right? Especially like PC and other platforms that Nintendo games aren't on. So that is a way that it really helps differentiate you. One is by platform and two by demographic, because the people who play those types of games are also different. Right? So that's market segmentation. And another fallacy that people sometimes fall into is they'll look at popular games, right? And they'll say, hey, Mario did things this way. Maybe we should do things that way too. Or the opposite of that as well. So for example, hey, Mario doesn't have a great story, so our game doesn't need a great story. Or maybe Mario, doesn't have the most amazing networking and it's doing fine, so we don't need to do that. And that's a different type of fallacy, I think, that people are falling into. And that's basically because you're in a different situation from these games, right? So you're in a situation where you need to stand out, right? While other people might be in a situation where they're trying to widen their audience. And so you have different priorities, right? Another way to see this is in a totally different media, right? So let's say in music, some people might say, hey, pop songs, why do they, sound all the same? Or why do they not sound as good as some of these weirder bands? And I think a big reason for that is they don't need to, right? They're already in a place where people listen to them. So all they need to do is make sure that generally most people like them, right? They don't need to stand out, so they don't need to do weird things. And a lot of times, sometimes they start off more unique, and as they grow bigger, then they can become more and more consumer friendly. And so, in other words, if you have limited time, and if you're not, Mario, then generally make your game better at the thing that makes it special instead of making it decent at everything. And the reason for that is so that it can stand out better, and it can be, the first in whatever category it wants to be. So, and here's some more kind of detailed tips on maybe how to think outside the box, right? To help you do that. So advice on this and advice on kind of creative thinking is always a little bit vague. But if you look at a lot of stuff, I feel like there's some repeated patterns, right? I think one of them is, discover things that you already know. So when you're playing a game or you're watching a TV show, I think there are things that you'll notice that you maybe want to be better, or maybe you want to apply to something else. Things that inspire you that, will kind of pop up in the back of your mind. And it might be, hey, I've always liked this type of game or this type of TV show, but I really wished, they would have done something different, something like that. And if nothing in particular kind of inspires you for those kind of thoughts, then you can also, branch out a little bit, see more stuff, try to decide whether you like them or not. 2, and I think it's let your mind wander. So a lot of people say the best ideas come, either when they're showering or before sleeping. And that's the same for me too, right? It's usually when I'm don't have something that I immediately need to do and I can't really do anything else, but my mind's still, thinking about things. And I think it's a good opportunity during that time, to let your brain make a bunch of interesting connections. And a tip is to also not be too tired, right? Don't be so tired that you can't really think, or don't be so occupied that, you're always thinking about something else. So 3 is to chat with others. I haven't found as much success as other people, maybe because I'm more introverted, but you can always find like-minded people that you can bounce ideas with. And here's maybe a different example of how sometimes you need to break rules to make things work for you based on your particular circumstances. So in our game, we have portals, right? And of course, if the portal gets bigger, then your own relative size becomes smaller. So when that happens, we have to adjust the player's walking speed and jumping speed in order to make that physically work. Now, and all of that works fine, but the problem is when the size of the scale is too different. So, example, if you're very, very small, very, very big, there actually something weird happens, right? And the weird thing that happens is actually pretty subtle, which is this, right? Which is gravity in these cases are always constant. So things are always falling at the same rate, no matter how small or large they are. And so imagine you're in a movie and there's a giant shoe coming from the sky. Usually when you picture it, the shoe is moving super slowly, right? But in reality, if let's say time is not constant, time is like going at the same rate, this shoe should come down in like half a second, right? But it's always portrayed as something very slow. And the reason is because in real life, we're used to large objects moving at a certain speed. So they're always slower. Another example is in movies, sometimes they use miniatures instead of real sets, right? So for example, here, I think this is Die Hard, where they have an explosion, and the explosion runs at a certain speed. In order to make it feel real, they have to slow it down. And that really accounts for the difference in scale. So in our game, then, we had to do this really weird thing that generally seems like a really, really bad idea, which is, you have to scale gravity based off your own size. So that's just one of the weird things that because of our particular game, our particular circumstance, that we would have to do, but it would be the right thing to do. Okay, so finally, some takeaways. So basically what I'm trying to say is following rules can a lot of times be dangerous because everyone has their own circumstances, and success a lot of times is an exception every time, right? So in other words, you have to make the rules for yourself. Get to know yourself. What are your strengths and weaknesses? What can you live with? What can you not live with? How do you like working with people? Do you like working with people? What kind of games do you like? What kind of games do you like to make? What kind of resources do you have? And I think the more personal questions you can answer about yourself, about your own situation, the better they can find, a path to success that works only for you, right? And I think that's the real goal here. So that's basically it. That's the entire talk. There's my email if you have any questions. Feel free to send an email over. And thanks. And let me know if you have any questions.
很感谢就是刚刚 Albert 就是精彩演讲哈。那我们现在要进入 Q&A 的时间。那也是跟刚刚一样，我们的所有的问答 Q&A 都是透过 Slido 来进行，所以现在听完演讲的人，如果有问题的话，就请赶快到 Slido 的连结上面，然后把你的问题打出来。那也可以就是去投票其他人的问题，如果看到跟你想问的一样的话。好，那我们现在其实已经有几个问题了，所以我就直接从既有问题开始问。好 ，So okay, Albert, thank you for the talk. And I mean the audience question is currently coming in, and we already have a couple. So I will just start from the audience questions, and then I will try to translate your answers back. So if you can speak a little bit slower, that would be helpful.
Okay, should I stick to English or should I or just make sure I speak in one language, I guess?
If you're comfortable speaking in Mandarin, that will be totally fine as well.
Okay, 那如果一半中文英文的话，
好，
这样可以吗？还是
OK 一半也可以 half is fine.
Okay, 好。
Okay, so I guess the first question is when you are making Superliminal, this is a very long process. And a lot of similar questions actually, a lot of similar games actually came out during your development. So like Antichamber, Manifold Garden, right?
Right.
And other actually similar games. So have you ever worried about other people making similar kind of games or with similar mechanic with forced perspective? Like, what's your opinion on this?
Yeah, that's something I was definitely worried about quite a bit, because when the video blew up, like a lot of people saw it, right? So my thought was, hey, we need to finish this in like 2 years, or else someone else will make the game. But I think it's a weird thing. It's always a little bit hard. I think one thing is because so many people saw the video, they were kind of like, oh, okay, it's been done already. They're going to make the game. The game's already done. They didn't even bother at that point. And I feel like a lot of people who, know about the space and really care about space, and other developers, they also don't want to do something that's already been done. So I feel like in the field of novel mechanics, if actually putting your stuff out there sometimes actually helps you get rid of that worry in a sense.
Okay, so I'll do the translation first.
Okay.
就是第一个问题是关于说，在制作过程中，像 Superliminal 做那么久，那会不会担心别人做出类似游戏机制，然后可能在开发到一半的时候，就是已经被别人抢先这样子？那Albert 的回应是说，其实是一直有担心但是只是说，就是蛮意外的，好像在他一开始的那个影片，很多人看到之后，反而有一种他自己感觉到是一种效应，是说，其他也许也想要做类似游戏的人，他会发现，这个东西已经被别人做走了。那我基本上就是会避开已经很有名的。就是我会避开那种已经很有名的，就是已经有的案例这样子。那有时候开发者也会尽量避免，就是说自己做出来的东西，后来被人家认为说就是其实是跟前面一个人做的其实类似，即便他的游戏还没有真的推出，这样，他会觉得那是已经做过的东西，就不要再做。那
然后再讲一点，就是I feel like in terms of like new mechanics and stuff like that, it's actually really hard to make something that's really popular. So a lot of times if two people make the same thing, there's enough space for both, or they only hear about one of them, or, there's all these sorts of scenarios. So if somebody else is making the same thing you are, that's no reason to also stop making the thing.
Okay, makes sense. Yeah. 对，那就是在制作那种就是 机制很特殊的游戏的时候，应该说就是就是这种游戏，其实也它的设计空间其实是够大的。那如果你做了另外一款类似游戏，就是假设有另外一个人跟你做类似游戏，就是其实两个人的内容也许并不会完全一样。那你不应该在看到别人做类似的事情之后，就可能放弃自己目前正在做的东西。I guess that's a good paraphrasing.
Yeah.
So actually, I want to go back to your first point about many people have already seen the first video.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that has like you have to break through a critical mass for that to matter, right? Because I actually know like some other indie devs run into a situation where they posted something first. You know, things
right.
like you know, ridiculous fishing or things like that.
Yeah.
They posted something first, and then somebody copied them very quickly, and then the copycat actually got a lot more views or a lot more feedback from the gamers than the original one. Yeah. So is there any difference that set these two kind of scenarios apart?
Yeah, I think, and I think Rami has a talk about that too, which is that in his mind that ridiculous fishing was also relatively easy to clone, and it was for an audience that maybe didn't care as much.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, maybe the people who played it actually didn't know about this other game because they weren't following, you know, indie game developers and looking at their stuff. But if your game happens to be, you know, more on the niche side, then I think it's a little bit better, right?
Right.
Yeah.
OK， 对，那我刚其实想要补问的问题就是说，就是其实讲者他的最早期的那个影片，那个 prototype 影片，其实是真的是非常多人看到，那就是很快就有就是几十万 view 这样子。那有很多其他案例，其实是也有独立开发者很早期就播出自己的原型的影片或者是 demo 版，然后结果很快就被一些其他公司抄走。那 Albert 的回应是说，其实在这种情况下，就是应该说 Remy 好像就是那个 我刚刚有举个例子叫做那个 Ridiculous Fishing， 因为他后来被另外一间公司就是抄了一个游戏叫做 Ninja Fishing 这样子。那在那个案例情况底下，其实那个游戏本身它是比较容易直接被抄走，就是它的机制跟规模是比较小的。然后再来是那种游戏在当时的情况，就是说它的主要客群其实是比较就是算是比较休闲的开发，比较休闲的玩家。那他也许比较不太 care， 就是所谓真的很原创性，或者说他真的有在 follow 独立开发者的那种客群。那在那种情况下，确实如果你真的背一个比较大肩，然后手脚很快的就把你的概念抄走的话，其实也许你真的是没有办法。那如果你做的东西是更有利基市场，然后抄袭难度比较高的，那其实应该说在这种情况下是比较不容易发生。那所以说，就还是回到最原本的，他那个 demo 出来之后是第一个，那机制其实并不是很容易，就是说随便被人家抄走就延展。然后它的客群也是属于比较偏向真的会关心原创性，或者说关心独特玩法的那个玩家群。所以大家会觉得说，那这种东西就是尽量不要去抄它比较好。对 ，OK， so next audience question. So the next audience question is about the long development time. Like, do you at any point question yourself, you know, should you be keeping developing this game, or should you switch to other projects?
对，其实我当时做的时候会想说，如果真的做不出来，那我可能会到其他公司工作。就我其实边做的时候也有边投几个 resume 这样子，可是最后就是每到什么比较紧要的关头，都会说，OK， 就刚好现在做到哪里，然后继续做下去真的有意义吗？可是当然，我觉得不管做什么，做久了都会自己会有点怀疑啊，就是说， 其实我真能做完吗？或是我做这个东西真的有意义这样子？
那你是到什么时候开始就发现说我不再投其他公司的 resume？ 就是
对，就是我们开始找 funding 或是快拿到 funding 的时候就没办法，就只能做下去，
这个一定要做，钱都拿了。
对，有时候就是会发生这种事。可是我们做到一半的时候，就是也有说，如果就是钱刚好用完，我们可能有想说，需不需要做一些其他的 contract work，这样子。对，可是所以我觉得你做到中间，你有可能会说，我这样做就是到底有没有问题？可是有时候对，我觉得我们是比较幸运，就是最后又找到其他的 funding 之类的。
OK， 好，那下一个问题。
等一下我再补一点，就是我可能要讲的就是我自己在做的时候，就有一点就是说，我每次都有 Plan B 嘛，就是我现在做的最好的、最理想的就是这个游戏很成功。可是如果没办法的话，我还可以去找一些其他东西。所以如果我有个 Plan B 的话，其实我会比较不会那么害怕。
OK，
对，
就是永远有一个备案。
对，
理解。
好，那不会饿死，
不会饿死。好，那下一个问题是，如果是就是学生团队，然后他们可能是就是 junior 或 senior， 那就是算是比较没有 inexperienced teams, right? And then in this case, how can they come up with their original ideas, or do they have to always starting from, referencing other type of gameplays, or kind of like imitating other games? Like for inexperienced teams, what do you think about the student teams when they're making student projects? What should they do?
Yeah, actually, I think for student teams, I actually think they should do the opposite, which is they should do something crazy. They should try to shoot for the moon, because there's actually no stakes for failing. And that's a time where you can actually be like, what is the, screw other games, what's the craziest thing, that we might be able to accomplish within the time frame we have. I think another thing is like, as long as you've played enough games and you've seen enough games, I feel like you don't really need to start from the basics, right? You don't need to start from making Mario and then making, the next game Sonic, and then starting from scratch. You can be able to maybe play through an entire genre of games, within a couple of weeks. So I think actually people who don't have that much experience and they don't have that many stakes, so like they're not part of a company, they're not trying to raise a family, they have a big advantage and they can try some weird stuff. Yeah.
OK， 对，那这个问题是说，就是大三大四的学生，相较于成熟团队比较没有经验那是不是在这种情况下，只能先从接近其他游戏的玩法先做起？那其实 Albert 的建议是说，其实你如果是学生团队的话，就更不应该去担心这种事情，就是尽可能在你学生时代风险很低，然后没有什么压力，没有什么经济问题的情况下，就是能做最疯狂的事情，就是尽量去做不要说之后有了社会或是家庭压力，然后你那个时候才去想说我要怎么做创新之类的，就是其实你应该要把握你在学生还没有这些压力的时候去做这种事情。那就是这样子是最合理的选项啦，因为你越进社会，虽然你说你会越来越有经验没有错，但是其实你的社会压力会越来越大。对 Okay, so the next question is Okay, this is actually a really interesting design question. So when you're making an innovative mechanic or gameplay, like inevitably there's a lot of new things like players have never seen before in your game, and it will naturally, the game will naturally have more like learning, like higher, steeper learning curve, right? And so how do you strike a balance between putting a lot of new stuff or weird stuff, crazy stuff in your game, and balancing the learning curve of the new players?
For us, it wasn't really a question because we weren't thinking about what stuff counts more as more easier for the player to learn, but we did care about what stuff was more familiar to the player. So for example, we would try to combine weird projection techniques with something they've seen before. And that was more of a thing of like when you combine something familiar with something different, it's more interesting that way, instead of just being completely alien. So to us, the important thing was, okay, how do we get the most amount of interesting things in the game rather than necessarily if the players will understand them. But because we're doing this other thing, which is we're trying to make them interesting by attaching them to something familiar, they also just understood what they were in that.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. 就刚刚这个问题是说，就是像这样有很多创新机制的游戏里面，那有很多增加使用者的学习成本，那增加玩家的学习成本，那要如何在玩家的体验跟这种机制或者玩法创新之间取得一个平衡？那 Albert 的回应是说，其实他们在开发这款游戏的时候，这个其实并不是他们思考的问题，因为他们在做的东西其实也并不是说真的就是很夸张的天马行空，然后到玩家都没有看过。其实他们也是想办法先找出一些玩家可以看过、可以有应该说是认同感或是熟悉感的东西在里面，然后想办法把一些创新的机制或是玩法再跟那些熟悉的东西结合。那我自己以玩家的身份，我自己可以举一些例子啊，譬如说那个月亮，就是月亮可以移动的这件事情，或者说月亮可以互动的这件事情。那其实你也在譬如说传送门里面看过类似的案例这是破梗了，但是就是这是对，但是就是这种东西其实是玩家他可以理解或是可以去想象的。那虽然说他可能操作那个月亮的方式完全不一样，那我自己是觉得，就是这点其实，在 Superliminal 里面，因为我自己也是有全破，那我自己是觉得这个其实做的平衡是做的已经蛮好的，就是并没有说玩家下去，然后玩家因为是全部新的机制，玩家什么都看不懂这样子。对 ，Okay, I think that answers that. And let me check. 1, 2, 3. Okay, this is actually also interesting. I think you might have talked about this privately before. Can you share a little bit about approaching publishers and doing marketing with this type of game?
算是什么类型的游戏啊？
Like I mean, your game specifically, like Superliminal. What was your experience in talking to publishers, and then maybe later on you have to do the marketing yourself?
Yeah, for us it was kind of the same because I don't know if this applies very well to other people. I feel like each game is different, but for us, the way we market to someone is we just show them the mechanic and they get it and they think it's cool. I think it's the same way, kind of the same way we talk to publishers, right? At the beginning, all we really did was we sent them a build. We didn't even have a pitch deck. Usually, I don't think people would do that, but they've seen the concept before, so I I think they were able to be like, oh, this is like interesting enough that we're going to take a chance on it.
Right. Oh, okay, I'll translate that.
Okay.
就是Albert 说，其实他在找发行商跟在这个就是 Superliminal 的行销的过程，其实经验上是蛮类似的，因为其实他做的东西基本上就是说把，比如说游戏的玩法，或者是说 demo 版就直接推广出去。那基本上就是应该说有办法 get 到的人，就是他就是会 get 到，就是而且比如说他的玩法真的是玩法很特别，但是他又不是说完全都没有看过，让人家看不懂，所以其实有引起共鸣的人应该是蛮多的。那包括发行商这边也是这样，就是他们甚至在早期刚开始接触一些发行商的时候，是连就是提案的那个简报都没有送，就是直接把一个demo 版直接丢给发行商。那发行商他们其实多少都有看过，像因为我们其实刚刚都举过例子嘛，就是其实过去是有几款有名的类似游戏的哦，那他们其实一看就知道说这是这种类型游戏。那虽然还是有点风险，不过既然玩法跟这个游戏本身设计的品质看起来不错，那他们其实是愿意去冒这个风险来继续跟这个开发团队谈下去。Okay, this is kind of I don't know, career or life decision questions. It's like, so you finished this game, right? And would you be considering like making like, you know, your next game, or do you want to actually maybe try to do other things other than video games? And because you also explained in the slides that actually right now surviving in the games industry is actually really hard. So have you considered other options?
Yeah, I still want to do more games. I just think there's so many space in games that haven't, like, there's so many things that haven't been done before, and there's so many things that haven't been tried. It's one of the mediums that, like, there's not that many people that's been in it, so to speak. So compared to like
that's true,
movie industry or writing or and stuff like that, game industry is relatively new. So there's always new stuff coming out. There's always new stuff that you're like, wow, they should have made that, already. So I'm really excited about just being in the game industry.
Okay, yes. 那就是刚刚的问题是说，就是做完这款花那么多时间的游戏之后，还会想继续待在游戏业，继续做下一款游戏这样。那Albert 的回应是说，就是确实就是还会想要再继续开发游戏，因为他觉得游戏产业或者说游戏这种互动媒体，它的年龄还是很短的，就比起电影或者说文学小说之类的。那还有很多事情其实没有被尝试过，理论上是可以一直去发掘新东西的，不会因为说就做完这款游戏，然后就想要退休这样子，就会继续往下，会想要继续往下做。好 ，OK, this is not a question. This is a very common, very interesting comment. Someone said 大同电锅。
是对。
In the background, okay. Let's see. Okay, I don't know if this is applicable to you, but I guess I will ask this. So how do you go about making a plan for long-term game development schedule, or like, because this game Superliminal is actually in development for so long. Have you actually tried to make a plan for it and then say, we should finish a game in maybe 2 years, 3 years?
Yeah, I think part of the reason it took so long is me at least, I didn't do a good enough pre-production job. So for example, I didn't plan the whole process very well at the beginning. I didn't have entire vision. I was kind of figuring out step by step, and that's part of why it took so long, right? I would make a little bit, figure it out, make a little bit, figure it out. I think instead of that, I think the next thing for the next project, I will try to do a lot more pre-production in advance. Maybe bring people on a little bit later once the initial vision is a lot clearer, and so at that point, there's less lurking around and more just knowing exactly which field we should be playing in.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. 那刚刚的问题就是说，就是像就是开发期的规划应该要怎么制定，才不会说就是越开发越久这样。那 Albert 是回应是说，他做这款游戏的时候，确实很多时候就是一边做一边尝试，可能游戏机制、玩法或是关卡设计之类，就是他是要一直去尝试新东西。那当然，每次尝试新东西之后，他可能就会想到就是别的做法，或者说之前的东西可能要修改之类的。那他觉得未来如果他还要再做就是类似的计划的话，应该就是要在量产前期，就是量产期之前，在 pre-production 的时候，就是譬如说你在设计原型或者在制定玩法、整体游戏走向的时候，就是会需要花更多时间去做规划，然后其实让开发团队。因为他其实也是有蛮长一段时间其实是自己开发，那后来就是有找不少同事一起来开发这样。那他觉得说，其实应该是要把找人进来一起开发的那个时间点再往后移，就是要等整个游戏的规划方向更确定之后，然后才开始做量产。对，那其实这个应该也算是就是蛮常见的，就是第一次做大型专案的时候可能会遇到的问题，就是没有好好的做前期规划，然后或是 pre-production 没有好好做，那你到后面团队要进来了，然后关卡或是玩法再一直改，那当然就是会越拖越久。所以这个东西应该是要想办法再切得更清楚，那未来应该会往这个方向来改善。
Yeah. To follow up, personally, one of my problems was I'm really bad at following my gut and just going with what I like. Sometimes I would overanalyze and try to make sure, hey, the thing I'm making is like perfect from each angle, but instead I should be thinking about what I like instead of, oh, do other people also like this?
Right.
So that's my problem, right? But I feel like overall it's a very hard thing because, I mean, even The Witness took like 7 years. So
yeah.
I don't know if it's hard to get better at it.
Yeah, I mean, that totally makes sense. So, 对，那就是Albert 是说他自己比较容易就是质疑自己的决定，就是他不就是有时候有些直觉的想法，他可能不会真的去很全力的去推，然后可能会质疑说，就这个东西到底这样做出来，就是到底行不行？然后他会不会想说，应该要想办法让他想要做的东西是各个方面都很完美那种感觉，就是大家都可以接受那种状态。但是其实他应该要更听自己，就是说他自己到底想要做什么，他自己喜欢做什么。对，那这样子的话，应该才就是不会有那种太多犹豫不决的那种情况。对，那其实很多类似游戏大家都遇过，就是开发期很长，5年7年这种游戏，大概都遇过类似的阶段。好，那就是大概是刚刚的补充这样。好。So, I think because of the time issue, we actually hit the 1 hour mark. So I guess we'll end here, and then I mean, thank you for being here, and then thank you for the great talk, and so I'll try to do some promotion for you here because I know Superliminal. Superliminal is very close to 10,000 reviews on Steam, right?
It's alright.
对，就是
I didn't post that. That wasn't me.
I know. Yeah, just trying to just trying to help out a little bit. 对，就是 Superliminal 在 Steam 上快要到达那个1万评论了，就是请还没有玩的 朋友就是可以去支持一下。好，那我们今天很感谢 Albert 的精彩演讲，还有他这段的 Q&A。那请大家就是一样，就是虚拟掌声，然后再给一下。好，感谢、Thank you very much。
谢谢大家，谢谢 Johnson 帮忙翻译。好，拜拜。
拜拜。Thank you。
Thank you。